In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Medici, where marble statues cast long shadows in the flickering candlelight, a young diplomat named Alessandro discovered a leather-bound manuscript that would forever change his understanding of power. The year was 1513, and Niccolò Machiavelli had just completed his masterwork Illinois Principi. But this was not that famous treatise. This was something darker, more personal, written in the margins of history by a man who had witnessed the rise and fall of princes, the betrayal of allies, and the ruthless calculations that separated those who ruled from those who served. Alessandro's fingers trembled as he opened the manuscript, its pages yellowed with age and stained with what might have been wine or blood. The opening words struck him like a physical blow. Power is not a game for the gentle-hearted, nor is it a prize for the merely ambitious. It is a science, cold and precise, practiced by those willing to embrace the darkness that others fear to acknowledge. What followed was not a philosophical discourse, but a brutal examination of 10 strategies that had elevated ordinary men to extraordinary heights, while their more scrupulous contemporaries remained forever in their shadows. These were not the teachings found in the halls of universities or the sermons of priests, but the whispered secrets of those who had clawed their way to the pinnacle of human achievement and remained there, unmoved by the storms that destroyed their rivals. The first strategy revealed itself through the story of Lorenzo de' Medici's rise to power in Florence. While his contemporaries engaged in open political discourse and transparent negotiations, Lorenzo understood a fundamental truth that would echo through centuries: information is the ultimate currency of power, and those who control its flow control the very fabric of reality for everyone around them. Lorenzo had cultivated a network of informants that stretched from the lowest servants in rival houses to the most trusted advisors of foreign princes. But his genius lay not merely in gathering information any wealthy man could buy spies. His mastery was in the strategic dissemination of carefully curated truths and precisely crafted falsehoods. He understood that in a world where everyone claimed to seek truth, the man who could shape what others believed to be true held absolute power. Alessandro read with growing fascination how Lorenzo would plant contradictory information with different factions, then observe their reactions to determine their true loyalties and hidden agendas. A whispered rumor about a rival's financial troubles, strategically placed with 3 different sources, would reveal within days who could be trusted and who harbored treacherous intentions. The beauty of this strategy lay in its invisibility. His enemies destroyed themselves through their own reactions to carefully orchestrated intelligence. But information warfare was merely the foundation. The manuscript revealed how Lorenzo combined this with the second dark strategy, the systematic cultivation of asymmetric relationships. While others sought alliances of equals, Lorenzo understood that true power came from relationships where he held superior leverage. He would identify individuals in positions of influence who harbored secret vulnerabilities, financial difficulties, family scandals, hidden desires, and would position himself as the only source of their salvation. This was not mere blackmail, though that crude tool had its place. This was the art of becoming indispensable while maintaining the illusion of benevolence. A struggling merchant would receive a loan on generous terms, never realizing that Lorenzo had orchestrated the financial pressures that created the need. A noble family facing social disgrace would find Lorenzo's intervention saving their reputation, unaware that he had authored the rumors threatening their standing. Within months, these individuals would find themselves bound to Lorenzo not through contracts or threats, but through gratitude and dependence. The manuscript detailed how Lorenzo's web of obligation extended throughout Florence and beyond. Cardinals in Rome, banking families in Venice, military commanders in Milan all owed their positions, their fortunes, or their reputations to Lorenzo's intervention. Yet none could point to any moment where he had demanded their loyalty or threatened their independence. They served him willingly, believing themselves to be his allies rather than his instruments. Alessandro paused in his reading, disturbed by the cold precision of these revelations. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the pages as he absorbed the third strategy, the mastery of emotional intelligence as a weapon of control. This was perhaps the most chilling aspect of Lorenzo's methodology, his ability to read, manipulate, and exploit the deepest psychological drives of those around him. The manuscript contained detailed character studies that Lorenzo had compiled on his contemporaries, analyses that revealed an understanding of human nature that bordered on the supernatural. He had identified that all human behavior could be traced to a handful of core motivations: the desire for recognition, the fear of loss, the need for security, the pursuit of pleasure, and the drive for meaning. But his true genius lay in recognizing that these motivations existed in unique combinations within each individual, creating psychological profiles that could be exploited with surgical precision. A rival politician motivated primarily by recognition could be neutralized not through direct confrontation, but by ensuring that his successes were attributed to others while his failures were magnified. A merchant driven by security could be controlled by creating subtle threats to his stability, then offering protection through Lorenzo's influence. A young nobleman seeking meaning could be directed toward causes that served Lorenzo's interests while believing he was pursuing his own noble ideals. The manuscript revealed how Lorenzo had categorized the entire Florentine elite according to their psychological vulnerabilities, maintaining detailed records of their fears, desires, and blind spots. He knew which man's wife harbored ambitions that could be encouraged to create marital discord, which banker's son struggled with gambling debts that could be quietly managed, which merchant's daughter yearned for social advancement that could be granted or withheld. This knowledge allowed him to orchestrate events that appeared natural and inevitable while serving his strategic objectives. But psychological manipulation required a foundation of perceived legitimacy, which brought Alessandro to the fourth strategy, the systematic construction of moral authority through strategic virtue signaling. Lorenzo had understood that power exercised without ethical justification eventually provokes resistance, but power exercised under the banner of righteousness becomes nearly unassailable. The manuscript detailed how Lorenzo had positioned himself as the defender of Florentine liberty and republican values, even as he systematically undermined both. He sponsored public works that benefited the common people, funded artistic endeavors that glorified the city's heritage, and positioned his political maneuvers as necessary defenses against foreign tyranny. When he moved against political rivals, it was always under the banner of protecting the republic from corruption or external threats. This strategy required Lorenzo to maintain a complex balance, appearing virtuous enough to claim moral authority while remaining ruthless enough to achieve his objectives. He achieved this through the careful compartmentalization of his actions. His public persona was that of a patron, philosopher, and protector of Florentine traditions. His private decisions were made with cold calculation, implemented through intermediaries who bore the moral cost of necessary evils while Lorenzo maintained plausible deniability. The genius of this approach was that it made opposition to Lorenzo appear treasonous or immoral. How could good citizens oppose a man who had sacrificed so much for their welfare? How could patriots resist someone who stood as their bulwark against foreign domination? By wrapping his pursuit of power in the language of service and sacrifice, Lorenzo had made his authority appear not only legitimate but morally imperative. Alessandro's hands had grown cold as he read, the candle burning lower as the night deepened. The fifth strategy revealed in the manuscript was perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated, the deliberate cultivation of controlled opposition to create the illusion of democratic discourse while maintaining absolute control over outcomes. Lorenzo had recognized that completely suppressing dissent would eventually provoke revolution, but allowing genuine opposition would threaten his control. His solution was to create and manage his own opposition rivals who appeared independent but whose actions served his strategic interests. He would identify potential leaders of opposition movements and either corrupt them through benefits and privileges or neutralize them by elevating more manageable alternatives. The manuscript described how Lorenzo would encourage debates in public forums, ensuring that both sides of controversial issues had articulate advocates. But these advocates, unbeknownst to the public, had been carefully selected or influenced to ensure that all paths of discussion led to conclusions that served Lorenzo's interests. Opposition politicians received subtle guidance on which issues to emphasize, which arguments to avoid, and which compromises to accept. They believed themselves to be independent actors, fighting for their principles, while actually serving as pressure valves that channeled public dissent in harmless directions. This strategy extended beyond politics into economic and social spheres. Lorenzo encouraged the formation of merchant guilds that appeared to represent commercial interests independent of his influence, but whose leadership had been carefully cultivated to ensure their decisions aligned with his broader economic strategy. He supported artists and intellectuals who critiqued aspects of Florentine society, understanding that controlled criticism strengthened rather than weakened his position by creating the appearance of intellectual freedom while ensuring that fundamental challenges to his authority never gained traction. The sixth strategy revealed itself through Lorenzo's approach to long-term planning and strategic patience. While his contemporaries focused on immediate gains and short-term victories, Lorenzo operated on timescales that span decades. He understood that true power was not built through dramatic gestures or rapid conquests, but through the slow, methodical construction of systems that would ensure his dominance long after any individual conflict had been resolved. The manuscript contained planning documents that revealed Lorenzo's ability to think in generational terms. He had mapped out the education and career paths of young men from influential families, placing mentors and opportunities in their paths that would shape their worldviews and loyalties. He had invested in projects and institutions that would not yield returns for years, but would create lasting dependencies and obligations. He had identified emerging trends in trade, politics, and culture, positioning himself to benefit from changes that others had not yet recognized. This strategic patience allowed Lorenzo to appear reactive and defensive while actually controlling the pace and direction of events. When crisis struck Florence, and crises struck regularly in the volatile world of Renaissance Italy, Lorenzo was always prepared with solutions that appeared spontaneous but had actually been planned years in advance. His rivals, focused on immediate challenges, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by a man who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to anticipate future developments. Alessandro realized as he read that this strategy required not just intelligence but extraordinary self-discipline. Lorenzo had sacrificed immediate gratification countless times in service of long-term objectives. He had endured temporary setbacks and apparent defeats, knowing that they positioned him for eventual victories that would more than compensate for short-term losses. This patience had a psychological effect on his enemies, who gradually came to believe that opposing Lorenzo was futile, that he possessed some inherent advantage that made their resistance pointless. The seventh strategy emerged from Lorenzo's mastery of resource allocation and the creation of artificial scarcity. While others viewed wealth and power as finite resources to be hoarded, Lorenzo understood that control over the distribution of resources was more valuable than possession of the resources themselves. The manuscript detailed how Lorenzo had positioned himself as the gateway through which opportunities, favors, and privileges flowed throughout Florentine society. He did not need to own every business to control commerce, he needed only to control access to credit, licenses, and political protection. He did not need to hold every office to control government, he needed only to control who received appointments and promotions. This strategy required Lorenzo to maintain careful balance in his distributions. He provided enough benefits to his supporters to maintain their loyalty while ensuring that their dependence on his favor continued. He created artificial scarcities by limiting access to opportunities that could theoretically be available to all, then positioned himself as the benevolent authority who could grant special access to deserving individuals. The psychological impact of this strategy was profound. Throughout Florence, individuals at every level of society understood that their advancement depended not on their merit alone, but on Lorenzo's approval. This created a culture of deference and competition for his attention, as people sought to prove their worthiness for his favor. Meanwhile, Lorenzo maintained the appearance of fairness and meritocracy, claiming that he rewarded only virtue and ability while actually selecting beneficiaries based on their value to his broader strategic objectives. The eighth strategy revealed itself through Lorenzo's approach to managing time and attention as strategic weapons. While his contemporaries allowed their schedules to be dictated by external demands and social conventions, Lorenzo had recognized that control over his own time and the time of others was a fundamental source of power. The manuscript contained detailed schedules and protocols that Lorenzo had developed to maximize the strategic value of every interaction. He understood that accessibility bred familiarity and reduced respect, while excessive isolation created resentment and suspicion. His solution was to create structured scarcity around his presence, making himself available to specific individuals at specific times for specific purposes, while maintaining an aura of being constantly engaged in matters of great importance. Lorenzo had mastered the art of making others wait while appearing to be the victim of overwhelming demands on his time. Supplicants would spend hours in his antechambers, during which they would observe the parade of important visitors seeking his counsel, gradually understanding their place in the hierarchy of his attention. When they finally gained audience, they were grateful for the privilege and more receptive to his guidance. But this strategy extended beyond mere scheduling. Lorenzo had learned to control the pace and duration of conversations to achieve specific psychological effects. Brief encounters left important matters unresolved, creating ongoing dependence on his future availability. Extended discussions created intimacy and obligation, making the participant feel specially valued. The timing of communications, when to respond immediately and when to delay, became a form of conditioning that shaped how others related to his authority. Alessandro found himself checking the window as dawn approached, surprised by how quickly the night had passed. The ninth strategy revealed in the manuscript was perhaps the most ruthless: the systematic identification and elimination of potential threats before they could develop into actual challenges. Lorenzo had understood that waiting for enemies to reveal themselves was a luxury that men of power could not afford. Instead, he had developed a methodology for identifying individuals who possessed the combination of ability, ambition, and circumstance that could eventually pose threats to his position, then neutralizing those threats through preemptive action that appeared to be motivated by entirely different concerns. The manuscript contained risk assessment matrices that Lorenzo had created, categorizing potential threats based on their intelligence, resources, connections, and psychological profiles. Individuals who scored highly across multiple categories would find their circumstances mysteriously altered, opportunities would disappear, supporters would distance themselves, and obstacles would emerge that redirected their ambitions toward less threatening pursuits. This preemptive approach required Lorenzo to act against individuals who had committed no offense and might never have become actual enemies. But he understood that power was too precious to risk on the possibility that potential threats would remain potential. Better to be suspected of paranoia than to be destroyed by misplaced trust in human nature. The strategy was implemented with such subtlety that its targets rarely understood what had happened to them. A promising young politician would find his proposed legislation consistently delayed in committees. A successful merchant would encounter unexpected regulatory challenges that consumed his time and resources. A charismatic priest would receive a prestigious assignment that removed him from the political sphere. None could point to Lorenzo as the source of their difficulties, yet all learned to avoid actions that might threaten his interests. The final strategy revealed itself as perhaps the most sophisticated of all: the creation of systemic dependence that made Lorenzo's continued leadership appear essential for the stability and prosperity of Florence itself. This was the culmination of all previous strategies, the point at which his control transcended personal authority and became institutional necessity. Lorenzo had gradually restructured Florentine society so that its basic functions depended on systems he controlled. Trade relationships, diplomatic arrangements, financial mechanisms, cultural institutions, all had been subtly modified to require his ongoing oversight and approval. He had made himself not just powerful but indispensable, not just influential but irreplaceable. The manuscript revealed how this had been accomplished through a decades-long process of incremental changes that individually appeared beneficial but collectively created systemic dependence. New trade agreements required ongoing negotiation and management that only Lorenzo's diplomatic network could provide. Financial innovations created interdependencies that demanded his unique understanding of complex relationships. Cultural projects established institutions that required his continued patronage to survive. The genius of this strategy was that it made opposition to Lorenzo appear not just treasonous but suicidal. Even his enemies recognized that removing him would collapse systems upon which they themselves depended. His authority had transcended personal power and become structural reality. Challenging Lorenzo meant challenging the foundations of Florentine civilization itself. As Alessandro closed the manuscript, the first rays of sunlight were streaming through the palace windows. The candle had burned down to a puddle of wax, and his eyes ached from reading by its flickering light. But his mind was sharp with understanding, and his heart was heavy with the weight of knowledge that could never be unlearned. The 10 strategies revealed in Machiavelli's secret manuscript were not merely historical artifacts but living principles that operated in every arena where human beings competed for advantage. From the merchant houses of Florence to the royal courts of Europe, from the banking families of Venice to the military orders of the Church, the same dark patterns repeated themselves with mechanical precision. Information control created the foundations of power, while asymmetric relationships provided the leverage to exercise it. Emotional manipulation enabled precise targeting of opponents, while moral authority provided protection against retaliation. Controlled opposition channeled dissent into harmless forms, while strategic patience allowed long-term positioning that overwhelmed short-term tactical advantages. Resource gatekeeping created dependencies that could be exploited, while time management established hierarchies that reinforced authority. Preemptive threat elimination removed challenges before they could mature, while systemic integration made power appear necessary rather than imposed. Together, these strategies formed an integrated approach to human dominance that was both ethically horrifying and practically irresistible. They revealed the machinery that operated beneath the surface of Renaissance politics, the hidden engines that drove the rise and fall of dynasties, the secret science that separated those who shaped history from those who merely endured it. Alessandro understood as he carefully returned the manuscript to its hiding place that he now possessed knowledge that could transform his own modest circumstances or destroy his soul in the process. The strategies worked precisely because they exploited the gap between human aspirations and human nature, between the ideals people professed and the motivations that actually drove their behavior. Lorenzo de' Medici had not been evil in any conventional sense. He had been a patron of arts, a defender of his city, a man who had brought prosperity and stability to Florence during turbulent times. But he had achieved these noble ends through methods that revealed the darkness that lurked within the human heart, the willingness to sacrifice others' autonomy for one's own vision of order, the readiness to manipulate truth in service of what one believed to be larger truths, the acceptance of means that contaminated even the most virtuous ends. The manuscript had revealed that power was not corrupting because it revealed hidden evil within those who possessed it, but because it demanded choices that good people in powerless positions never had to make. Lorenzo's strategies were dark not because they were motivated by malice, but because they were motivated by a clear-eyed understanding of human nature that most people preferred to deny. As Alessandro walked through the awakening streets of Florence, observing the merchants opening their shops, the priests making their way to morning prayers, the nobles beginning their daily rounds of social and political obligations, he saw them all with new eyes. Behind every smile was calculation, behind every friendship was advantage, behind every act of apparent generosity was the expectation of return. The 10 dark strategies were not aberrations practiced by uniquely ruthless individuals, they were the natural evolution of human competition in environments where the stakes were high enough to justify the moral compromises they required. They represented the logical endpoint of strategic thinking applied to social relationships, the inevitable result of treating human interaction as a form of warfare where victory went to those willing to employ weapons that others refused to consider. Alessandro realized that he now faced the same choice that had confronted every individual who had ever glimpsed the true mechanics of power: he could pretend ignorance and remain forever vulnerable to those who understood these dynamics, or he could embrace the darkness and begin his own journey toward the heights that Lorenzo had achieved. The manuscript had not provided a guide to evil, it had provided a mirror that reflected the evil that already existed within the human condition. Lorenzo's genius had not been in creating these dark strategies but in recognizing and systematizing principles that operated whether they were acknowledged or not. In a world where others employed these methods unconsciously or hypocritically, Lorenzo had gained advantage through conscious application and honest acceptance of their moral costs. As the sun climbed higher over Florence, Alessandro made his choice. He would study the strategies, understand their mechanisms, and prepare himself to operate in a world where power was the ultimate currency and innocence was a luxury that only the powerless could afford. He would honor Lorenzo's legacy not by becoming a monster, but by becoming the kind of man who could compete with monsters and win. The 10 dark strategies would become his secret education, his hidden curriculum in the arts of influence and control. He would learn to gather information like a spider collecting flies, to build asymmetric relationships like a general positioning his forces, to manipulate emotions like a musician playing an instrument. He would master the appearance of virtue while practicing the reality of calculated action, create controlled opposition while maintaining absolute control over outcomes, and develop the patience to think in decades while others focused on days. Most importantly, he would learn to make himself indispensable to systems larger than himself, to become not just powerful but necessary, not just influential but irreplaceable. He would study the human heart with the same precision that astronomers studied the stars, understanding that both were governed by laws that could be discovered, predicted, and exploited by those with sufficient dedication to the pursuit of truth. The manuscript had taught him that the real division in human society was not between good and evil, but between those who understood the rules by which power actually operated and those who lived in comfortable delusions about how they wished those rules worked. Lorenzo de' Medici had achieved greatness not because he was better than his contemporaries, but because he was more honest about what greatness required. Alessandro walked through the gates of the Palazzo Medici with a new understanding of the shadows that danced in every corner of human civilization. The 10 dark strategies would be his compass as he navigated those shadows, his weapons as he fought battles that others pretended did not exist, his tools as he shaped a world that would remember his name long after the comfortable delusions of his contemporaries had been forgotten by history. In the end, the manuscript had revealed that darkness was not the opposite of light but its necessary foundation, that power was not the corruption of virtue but its practical application, and that the strategies of dominance were not perversions of human nature but its most honest expressions. Alessandro had learned to see the world as it truly was, and that sight would guide him toward heights that those who clung to prettier visions would never reach. The 10 dark strategies lived not in the pages of ancient manuscripts but in the daily interactions of every human society, waiting to be recognized and mastered by those bold enough to acknowledge their existence and wise enough to understand their proper application. Alessandro had become such a man, and Florence would never look the same to him again. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Sonnet 4. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.